Afaf, let's start. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is Amani, Demian, and my co-presenter, Afaf Mishriki. We're both senior instructors at the American University in Cairo. And today our presentation is entitled L1 and L2 class, when, why, and how. And this is based on reporting on one of the studies that we conducted at our institution. Okay. Now, these are some questions that we'd like you to think about. And because we're afraid we don't have enough time to receive your answers, so just think about them as we are going along the presentation. How many of you use L1 in their L2 classes? Why do you use it? Why do you use it? For what purposes? And why don't you use it? If you're not using it, why don't you use it? What are the odds against it? Okay. Okay, now why L1 should not be used in L2? These are some of the beliefs that we were taught, about, we're trained to follow and so on. And one of them is that we need to give our students maximum exposure to L2, which will enhance their knowledge and accelerate their learning. Also, students are skeptical about the use of L1, especially at higher levels. They don't want their teachers to use L1. And students will become dependent on L1 and will not understand meaning from context, which is something that we would like to enhance in our students. Also, but what now is the current significance of studying the role of L1 in L2? Why is it beneficial? First, learners cannot escape the influence of L1. So you have to be realistic and admit that they cannot. And this happens when even proficient learners resort to L1 by glossing new foreign language words. The majority keep mentally translating as they're reading. And in group work, most students conduct the activities in L1 despite the instructions of the teachers not to. We always tell them, please discuss the ideas together in English. Don't resort to your language, Arabic or whatever the language is, but this also does not maintain for a long time. Also, both teachers who are native speakers of L1 and L2 sometimes feel they need L1 for quick translation of words and or structures, or for contrastive analysis when they are explaining different structures in both languages. And teachers feel guilty when they have to switch to L1 due to their learning and training, for fear of breaking school rules or worrying about impeding the students' learning of L2. Now, there are some theories that actually support in one way or another the use of L1 in L2. And one of them is the fifth hypothesis of Krashen, which is the affective filter hypothesis. And it says that language learners will filter or block out the target language if they do not, if they are not comfortable, if they are tense, if they are under tension, if they're not feeling, comfortable with what they're listening to. Therefore, students who are confused will become frustrated, upset, angry, and resentful of the environment of the language classroom, and therefore acquisition will not take place. And this is something that we don't want to happen. Another hypothesis also of Krashen is the fourth hypothesis, which is of the monitor model, which is the input hypothesis, which says that providing language learners with comprehensive input is an important factor for acquisition. So therefore, optimal acquisition will occur when students can understand most of the input through reading and listening, while being challenged by some new items. So, Afaf, Krashen calls this I+1, and the I refers to the attainment of the student at this level, and 1 represents the new material that goes beyond their level of attainment. But if this I+1 becomes I+2 or I+3, incomprehensive input will result, which also will raise the student's affective filter and will hinder their language acquisition. Therefore, the students L1 can assist in making the classroom a more comprehensible place, help lower affective filter and thus raise their motivation and self-image, and facilitate L2 acquisition. And we have heard so many presentations so far in the yesterday and today about how translanguaging is not a hindrance to L2 acquisition. Okay, now our current study, the population were 7 classes, and total of 88 students. These 7 classes were made up of 43 students in an intensive English program where students receive only English for 5 hours a day, 4 days a week. And 45 students were semi-freshman students. These were another group of students who had English also 4 days a week, but only for 3 hours. And they were allowed to take 2 other academic courses besides their English program or the English program. And also we had this study was conducted on both students and teachers. We had 13 English language instructors, 6 of them were native speakers and 7 were non-native speakers. 5 from the intensive English program where they teach 5 hours a day, and 8 from the English Auto 10 course, which is the semi-freshman course. Afaf?
All right. The tool we used to conduct the survey was a questionnaire, actually 2 questionnaires, one for students and one for teachers. The responses of both students and the teacher were in the form of a Likert scale, a 5-point scale, ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And the 2 questionnaires were given during the first week of classes. The prompt to the questionnaire was as follows: to rate the statement from 1 to 5 on the following scale. And we glossed the words that may not really be very familiar to the students so that they can use them the same way we want them to use, which is what's native language, what's L1, what's L2, and what do we mean by occasional. This is the student questionnaire. It consisted of 11 items or 11 statements, and they had to respond to these statements. I will go over the ones that actually the results were significant or were sometimes not what we actually expected. For example, I would like my teacher to use L1 in explaining grammatical structures. The occasional use of L1 in the classroom helped me feel confident about what I understood, or the teacher should not use L1 because it will confuse my colleagues who have a different L1. The teacher's questionnaire was a bit longer, and the statements were about how they felt about using L1 in their classes. Like, for example, number 2, ESOL classes should be a haven of English use, and use of native language should be left at the door. Or number 5, I find it disruptive when students use L1 among themselves during class, even if they are on task. Or number 8, using L1 can facilitate communication and help in developing the relationship between students and teachers. Also, something like number 13, I can occasionally accept a student's response in L1 if it serves a good purpose. One thing I'd like to emphasize is that the institution we work in, the American University in Cairo, is an English medium instruction university. So everything is supposed to be conducted in English, and the university frowns upon the switch to Arabic, especially when the students start complaining. Of course, in the English courses, we're not supposed to use Arabic at all. However, we wanted to see how much students may accept occasional use of Arabic for certain purposes and for very, very specific goals, and teachers too. Okay, let's see some of the results. All right, so for a statement like this, I will be, that's a student questionnaire. I will be embarrassed to express myself freely in the presence of my native English speaking teacher. Okay, so what we found was this. Okay, if you look at the percentages of students, the lower the language proficiency, those in the lower group, the more self-consciousness. So yes, they were more embarrassed to express themselves in English because they were not very, very sure of their language. But the higher the language proficiency, the more self-confident the students were, and therefore they responded negatively to this item. Graduate students are more self-conscious because of age, and therefore sometimes they're more reluctant to express in L2, especially if they're not very sure of some words or expressions or something like that. So as you see, 50% of the grads said sometimes they were not very sure that they are confident to express themselves in English in front of their teacher. As a university student, I do not expect my English teacher to use any L1 in class. Remember now, it's an English medium university. That's a very important factor. Okay, again, if you look at the percentages for a second or two, you can find that at a lower level, students need to be secure that the kind of instruction they get is the best, especially that they pay a lot of money. So 91% of the lower level of IEP, the intensive English program, 71% of the higher intensive English program said yes, that the teacher should not actually use any Arabic at all. Okay. The occasional use of L1 in the classroom helps me feel confident about what I understood. Occasional use. Can conclude that despite the fact that they did not admit the benefits at the beginning in their previous responses, the response to this question shows that L1 does play an important, maybe latent psychological role in L2 acquisition. The teacher should not use L1 because it will confuse my colleagues who have a different L1. Every now and then, yes, we do get students whose native language is not Arabic. Using Arabic may be disruptive to them. So what do they feel about that? But the majority actually are native speakers of Arabic. So surprisingly, some students' responses showed that they did not really mind the teacher's use of L1, even if their colleagues had a different L1. The lower level group said that their answers reflected their need for L1 input. Okay. Let's go to the teacher's questionnaire, and these are again selected items, not everything. Using L1 in L2 classes is unacceptable. Okay, as you see here, 17% of the native speakers of English, okay, said that they should not, and 50% of the non-natives, which were actually L1, I mean, their native language was Arabic, said that they agreed. Non-native speakers' reaction could be due to their being self-conscious. Okay, so as a non-native speaker of English, I may actually be reluctant to use Arabic because I don't want anybody to say or feel that I'm not competent at using the language, or I cannot conduct my whole class from A to Z in English. Okay, so they may feel uneasy, threatened, guilty, incompetent if they do. And this may even violate the rules or all that they have been trained to do, and that was actually at a certain point in time a taboo. Okay, but native speakers are a bit more lenient in their reaction, maybe because sometimes they cannot, or mostly cannot, actually resort to our L1, which is Arabic, or they do not have the choice between the two languages, so they don't mind the occasional use of Arabic. All right, sometimes it's easier and faster to say a few words in L1. Using L1 can save time and confusion. 83% of the native speakers of English and 86% of the non-native speakers agreed. Okay, despite the apparent rejection of the use of L1, most native and non-native teachers admitted that it saves time and confusion and is useful in facilitating the checking of comprehension of words and concepts, enhancing relationships, and managing the classroom. Occasional use of L1 can provide weaker students with a sense of security in their ability to understand L2. Non-native speakers respond that L1 provides security is contradictory actually to their strong feelings against the use of L1. Remember the very first question I showed They were against using L1 altogether, but now they feel that it does provide security to those students who are not very proficient in L2. As a native speaker of English, I feel my non-native colleagues have an advantage over me. Or as a non-native speaker, I feel that my native colleagues have an advantage over me. Okay, so what can be seen here is that almost half of the native speakers agreed that non-natives have an advantage. Sometimes because students communicate in Arabic anyway, so maybe they are at a disadvantage at that time. 70% of the non-natives disagreed that natives have an advantage over them. So both groups, non-natives and natives, admitted that non-native teachers are at an advantage to a certain extent. And both groups believe in the role of L1 in giving non-natives some advantage over the native colleagues. Okay, based on the student survey, we can see that students with lower proficiency, who are also newcomers, okay, because when they start their university and they're not that proficient, they take the intensive course, so they're newcomers anyway. So those with a lower proficiency or at the lower levels might not have tried both kinds of teachers before, so they could not really properly compare between them, unlike those who have had some experience and could understand the value of having a native L1 teacher. Also, they might feel patronized if the teacher provided explanations of words or concepts or structures or gave instructions in L1. They have chosen to be in this kind of university, so they expect L2 to be used all the time. The exception might occur in test situations when they have to be sure that they understand the instructions very well. The risk is high, so they may find it really beneficial to resort to L1 for a little while in order to clarify a point or two. Graduate students are more mature and have more ideas to express. They're keener on knowing the exact meanings of words. So they want their teachers to understand them regardless of the language. So they want to check, they want to learn, it's true. They want to express, they have a lot to say and so on. So they would like to use L1 as their crutches sometimes in order to make sure that what they've learned is the proper thing to say or to, check the fine tuning of words and so on. Graduates' responses clustered in the middle of the scale. They did not take extreme positions. So being adults, they're more realistic in their outlook and more moderate in their responses. The higher the language proficiency, the more self-confident the students are. So the occasional switch to L1 does not bother them. They're also required to use sophisticated vocabulary in their writing. They write academic essays, integrated essays. Later on, they'll be asked to write research and so on. And knowing, they want to know the fine differences between the structures. They need to know the subtle differences between the words. So they find the use of L1 beneficial. Almost all groups felt that the use of L1 is beneficial in facilitating comprehension. In addition, they admitted that the benefit of L1 in raising their confidence is what is understood despite their previous negative responses. This shows that L1 plays an important psychological role in L2 acquisition. From the teacher survey, we can see that non-native teachers may fear losing control if they allow any L1 in their classes. So from day one, I say no Arabic, and that means no Arabic. So I don't want to revert to L1 for fear that everything will be done in L1. Of course, it shouldn't. But for native speakers, the use of L1 may be truly distracting because students can use their L1 in discussing irrelevant topics, especially when they're doing group work. Some teachers use L1 to clarify the use of a grammatical structure that has no equivalent in L1, or a cultural concept, or a difficult vocabulary item. They use it also to give direct explanation when things really go wrong, or to pick up the discussion when communication breaks down. Some teachers use L1 to add an element of fun to the classroom and to bond with their students. Even native speakers sometimes use our L1 to joke with their students and break the ice, and to show them that they know some words or expressions and so on, and that does break the ice sometimes. Others use L1 to express dissatisfaction or to ensure discipline. Okay. More respondents, students and teachers agreed that exposure to L2 is important even if there's low comprehension. Okay, Amani?
Now we come to the conclusions, and there are many, and these are only some of them. The use of L1 can be more productive than counterproductive, while the aim should be to wean students of L1 as soon as possible. So that we have to have this goal in our minds all the time. L1 can be complementary to foreign language acquisition, not a betrayal to good teaching practices. So don't feel very guilty if you sometimes resort to L1. And the judicious use of L1 in English class is an important learning tool. We have to know when to use it and how to use it and how much of it and so on. A responsible mother tongue use saves classroom time and devotes it to other learning activities. So when we use it in the right time for the right purposes, it saves time. The use of L1 should not be prohibited for its own sake, but allowed occasionally as an additional tool in the repertoire of the teacher and the learners as conditions warrant. So we have to have it as a tool that we resort to whenever needed. Okay. Okay, now we have a quotation here from Case. The only sensible reaction an individual teacher can take to this controversial subject is to neither accept nor reject the use of L1, but simply to search for an ideal level of its use in each individual class. So maybe some classes will need more L1 than others. And as we said, as we saw in the study, depending on the level. Maybe changing its use as the class progresses in level or changes in other ways. Okay, now we had some limitations for this study, and one of them was the sample sizes of the lower classes, lower proficiency classes, the English 101, and the grads groups were small, and also the sample sizes of the different groups were different. Also, the students' questionnaire was given at the beginning of the semester or the school year, and when students did not have enough experience. So they were just admitted to university with very little experience or none in this respect. Many responses might have reflected what students believe teachers' expectations to be, not what they actually thought and believed in. And it would have been easier for both respondents and researchers if the scale had been inverted, because it was done the other way around. Afaf? Now we have some suggestions also for further research, which is, one of them is there is a need for broader research to establish parameters to build a framework of principled use by comparing results from different countries and from different learning situations. Also, to facilitate comparison, questions in both questionnaires should be equivalent and should take into account whether the learning group is monolingual or multicultural. And research should explicitly consider two basic questions that are very important in this topic, which are when to use it and what for, the purpose. There is also a need for more research that takes into account learners' perspectives about the use of L1 in their L2 classrooms. Okay, now these are our references, and we'll be happy to take any questions if you have any. Thank you very much for attending, and we can share our email addresses on the chat if you need them. Thank you very much. I think here are
Here
our,
they are.
yes,
Here they are.
These are our email